I'm here today with Dr. Jerry Hendrix. He's the director of our Defense Strategies and Assessments program, and he's the author of a new report, Avoiding Trivia, a strategy for sustainment and fiscal security. Now, this report is a little bit different for CNAS. The piece is argumentative, and it is one of the most ambitious pieces I have ever read. It takes on grand strategy, trying to chart a new course for the U.S. with a little help from Jerry's hero, George Kennan. If you'll indulge me, Jerry, I'd like to ask you a few questions about the report and just have a little conversation about it.
Sure.
So in the report you argue that America is its own worst enemy, that only America can undermine her primacy in the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The United States has made a series of strategic decisions since the end of the Cold War, which have progressively placed itself into greater and greater extremis. Those things come from not only its security commitments with forces having been deployed overseas to fight al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then opening the front in Iraq on charges of finding weapons of mass destruction there that didn't pan out. And those both raised our defense spending and our overall budget, even though we didn't raise taxes at the same time. And so we saw our budget deficit soar to the point in time where now our deficit exceeds the size, our debt exceeds the size of our GDP, which is generally, when you're an economist who's looking at world economies, once you begin to see that, you begin to realize the country is in danger, because then its interest payments begin to grow and grow within its annual budget, and you have little room then to take on other issues like infrastructure. So we're actually watching not necessarily the rise of challengers be the primary threat to the United States, as our own inability to address our fiscal issues at home and then to be able to provide for ourselves into our future. And so these are the issues I think that confront us today.
And now what's funny is you're talking like a bit of a more progressive and more liberal person, but you're really not. In fact, you use one of the words that is like nails on a chalkboard to conservatives. Namely, you talk about how profligate we've been. Mm-hmm. How does being profligate, both domestically and abroad, undermine our national security?
Well, the fact is that it's not so much that we chose to spend more. It's that we have failed to actually make the decisions on how to have our revenues equal our spending. And this is another area where it's a fingers on the chalkboard for a lot of conservatives. I consider myself to be a conservative. In fact, I come from a region of the country. I'm a native Hoosier from Indiana. I'm a farmer. And I consider myself to be an Eisenhower Republican, which means I do believe in a strong defense, but I believe that you actually have to pay for it. You have to make that the money in equal the money going out. And so this spending, this idea that we would just decide to spend more on defense, that we would accept deficit spending in order to meet our nation's national security goals. At the same time, quite frankly, we went through the downturn in the economy in 2008, which necessitated some stimulative spending. That again raised our debt and our deficit going forward, and this has placed us in jeopardy. And so as part of this, I'm calling for a balanced approach to cutting defense, because I think that that's coming. The 2011 Budget Control Act and the sequester is still in place, and we're going to see defense come down in accordance with those budget caps. But there's the other aspect of this too that we do need to address: entitlement spending, and we also have to address revenues in order to bring our budget into balance and get our nation's fiscal foundation back on firm ground.
Now, the report and you yourself are nothing if not a big thinker, and one of the things you've advocated for is the grand bargain. Getting back on solid financial footing is, as you argue, key for the U.S. But our political system has almost broken down to the point where that sort of flexibility, those sorts of deals, aren't really happening that much anymore. Can you talk about how you could see this sort of bargain actually coming to fruition?
For the better part of 50 years, this country operated on a bipartisan consensus in national security. We recognized both as Republicans and Democrats, both as progressives and conservatives, that there was an area where we dare not disagree, and that goes to our national security, our position vis-a-vis the outward approach of this nation to the world. That has come into question. In fact, it's fractured during my professional lifetime over the last 25 years. And I think the time is now, because we are finding ourselves into extremis. We'll see the interest on our debt begin to rapidly escalate, almost in a logarithmic way, here within the next 2 years. And so I think if we need to come to a consensus now and gain trust back and forth between the parties on these vital issues. From the left, there's interest in infrastructure investments here at home. And from the right, there is an interest in having a strong national security. One of the arguments that I make, though, is it's possible to have a strong national security while spending less if we alter our spending plan and our research and development to invest in a new force structure going forward.
So almost like my old econ professor used to say, that which cannot go on does not go on. Mm-hmm. That if our current situation is unsustainable, it will not be sustained.
That's correct. And in fact, this is something that we see throughout history. If you're, as a historian, if you go back even to the time of Rome, you go forward with some of the great powers, the preponderant powers, this is generally where they run into problems, is where their promises exceed their ability to keep them. We need to start keeping our promises, both to our present generation, but also to the future generations that we're leveraging this debt against.
So one of the things you talk about in the report, along the lines of those promises, is avoiding trivia. In fact, it's right in the title. Mm-hmm. Where are we engaged now in what you would call trivial pursuits?
Well, this is always an area where it gets a little bit edgy, because then you have to start rendering judgments. Right now, the United States has global interest, and they define them as being everywhere. That cannot continue. We simply cannot afford to be involved in every issue around the world. And so what I call is for a clear-eyed, realistic approach to these issues out there. I bring up 3 issues in the paper, and I raise questions as to whether they're trivia or whether they're critical issues. One is in the Ukraine. Right now we make a lot out of the incursions of separatist groups into the eastern Ukraine. And the question that I raise on that is, Europe has continued to spend well below the 2% of its GDP goal on defense issues. And so you have France and you have Germany who are out there talking about Russia, but are they in fact reflecting those concerns in their budgets? As long as the rest of NATO is not taking these issues seriously, not making those investments, I think the United States should question what our level of participation is. We cannot be the answer to everyone's problem. I think that Ebola, the use of the military forces, the 5,000 plus American soldiers in Africa, was that the best use of those soldiers, or was that in fact sort of an excuse to put the military out there at a time when the budget is under consideration and the Army is trying to raise questions about the wisdom of continuing to cut the Army down? I think there was probably more appropriate government services or international organizations that could respond to the Ebola crisis. And then we have ISIL. The United States' interests in the Middle East are largely driven on the need for regional stability there and its impact on energy and petroleum markets. Right now, fracking and new technologies have opened up vast reservoirs of energy elsewhere in the world, decreasing the relative importance of the Middle East in the overall energy picture. As we look at what's going on with ISIL, in fact, the people who are most appropriately placed to counteract ISIL as a religious extremist organization are in fact the moderate religious leaders in the Middle East, specifically the powers in Turkey, in Jordan, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia. These have been the traditional centers of religious leadership. And if they're going to delegitimize ISIL, it needs to come from them. The United States, as a Western power, is never going to be in position to be able to delegitimize ISIL. So again, let's put the emphasis where it needs to be, provide the support, but at the appropriate level, but simply don't commit the United States to these large-scale actions going forward. We have interests elsewhere, including at home.
The report is nothing if not controversial. One of the most interesting parts of the report is where you systematically go through the quote-unquote rising powers and mention that all of them are really not in any position to knock the U.S. off of the primary or strongest position in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Can you do that a little bit with us here? Can you talk about those powers?
Well, the three areas that I looked at was one, Europe, because you look at Europe, if we combine the economies of Europe, they're actually quite large, they're quite substantial. Their militaries, if they were combined, would be one of the largest military forces on the planet. However, they're not. They're not combined, and in fact, Europe's fractured sense of self. It's the individual nations clinging to their distinct languages, their distinct cultures, and their distinct budgets are not allowing them to come together and to coalesce and to gain efficiencies of scale and to really consolidate their power in the most efficient and effective manner. So I don't see Europe coming together anytime soon, and certainly the budget issues that they're facing at this point in time are not going to allow them a lot of leeway. We looked at Russia. Russia, of course, is gaining a lot of focus right now on the international level.
We could even call it notoriety.
Yeah, looking at what they've done in Georgia and in the Crimea and now in the Ukraine, certainly Russia seems to be a rising threat. But in fact, if we look at Russia's overall size of their defense spending, they have a budget of about $80 billion. Our budget's about $600 billion. We look at the size of their force, their military force, it's less than half the size of our overall military force. And so what I call for is sort of keeping things in perspective. If Vladimir Putin wants to make a major effort that actually threatens a vital U.S. interest, I think we're in a position to counter that. Again, we need to keep it at the appropriate level. Russia's also got a demographic issue in that the average age of their population is declining. We're seeing alcoholism on the rise, and their birth rate is going down. And so Russia is sort of a slow-moving train wreck right now that we need to get out of the way of and allow it to have its wreck. Then I also bring up China, which is sort of the one who most prominently comes up.
Yeah.
Clearly we see China's economy has been growing at large rates. Those rates are actually coming down now. We have estimates that their GDP growth may be as little as 6.5%. Some analysts believe that their GDP growth has actually been as low as 2% over the last year. They're in a real economic stall at this point in time. We see a consolidation of power with President Xi Jinping, and that issue is going to be something they'll have to settle on the inside. And we see their military growing, but again, our military is larger than the next 8 militaries of the world combined, and 6 of those are our allies. So again, I think we have to place things in context. All of those powers, China included, really if they were going to rise and gain preponderance, they would have to depend on the United States to collapse. Unfortunately right now, because of our own decisions, we're sort of aiding that, and that's the point that I take up, that we need to reverse course on that.
And that's actually one of the most pointed things about the piece. You are one of the rare military men arguing for affirmatively less military funding. Why do you think we're spending too much? Where do you think we're spending too much? And what would cutting defense budgets actually do to make us more secure?
One of the key facts to keep in mind is that if we compare the budget that we have today with the budget we had on September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11, our budget today is well over $100 billion more. The size of our older military force, the overall military force, is larger. And yet, on September 10th, 2001, we said that we were ready to fight 2 major regional conflicts, and then we went and did that. Today, with the force that we have, which is substantially larger, we say that at most we can fight 1 major regional conflict and do a holding action in a second. We have more money, we have more forces, and yet we can do less. What that fundamentally indicates to me is that we've made some unwise decisions on what we've invested in over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think we need to go ahead and take a look as that budget comes down, as it's going to. The Budget Control Act of 2011 is still in effect. The budget control or the budget caps are still there. We have to make decisions about how to invest more wisely. Quite frankly, there are ways that we can prioritize where we're going to invest. One of the key areas as we look at the pivot to Asia is we need to identify what capabilities we really need. Naval and maritime really emerge. We're still a global maritime economic power, so the oceans and the air are still areas that we need to maintain peace and stability in. So those have to be sort of the first priority. To what degree we need land power, that's in the Army and the Marine Corps, I think is the issue that we need to prioritize as well. And then ultimately we have to make research and development decisions on key technologies that will allow us to emerge from this period after we address our budget in a stronger position. I think this is part of that offset 3 strategy that we've all been talking about.
Unless we think that this is just a Navy guy arguing for more money for the Navy and less for ground forces, you have gone full bore after the aircraft carrier, even though, you know, if you talk about maritime security and air security, that would seem to be the pinpoint.
Yeah, the Navy saw its overall shipbuilding budget go up by nearly 35% over the last 15 years, and yet its ship count went from 330 ships down to 286. So it was spending more on ships but getting less out of that. Almost the same things happened within the aircraft inventory. And again, that reflects decisions to build more expensive but fewer what I would call exquisite platforms. And we need to address that by coming into a balance where we have some high-end platforms, but they're balanced with more numerous but cheaper and more simple low-end platforms to do the day-to-day presence operations that are necessary to maintain global stability. There has to be a balance going forward, and in fact, I believe that if we change our investment strategy, that in fact we can grow the Navy very quickly. In as little as 7 years, we can be well north of the 300 ships that are necessary. Actually, I believe we need about 350 ships to properly maintain stability throughout the maritime commons of the world.
So, most fundamentally, and perhaps most importantly in the report, you point to our need for a new strategic mindset. What should that mindset be?
Well, the mindset has to take into totality the challenges facing this nation. It has to look at the economic underpinning. It has to look at the global economy, which drives the wealth of this nation. It has to figure out how to maintain stability in that, and it has to be willing to make hard decisions, to make decisions in things in areas of entitlements, to make hard decisions, politically unsavourable positions in the area of revenues, you know, looking at raising revenues within the country. And then, of course, it has to continue to look at wise cuts within defense that maintain our capability to properly maintain stability in the world in the areas where we have interest. And then, like I said, one of the key things that this country needs to do is to be able to look at an issue as it comes up and say, I don't have an interest there, to learn how to say no to these rising issues around there. If we are able to actually do this, and that's a large wish list, then I think we can put the country back on a stable road to leadership in the world for another generation.
Well, Jerry, thanks so much. This has been remarkably enlightening. The report, again, is Avoiding Trivia, a strategy for sustainment and fiscal security. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.